Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel for this week's movie mystery. When I tell you that this video has been a ball ache, I am not joking. This is the second time I have recorded this. Turns out, remember, if you were here last week, I was having some problems with my microphone. I went and bought a new one. Turns out, it wasn't my microphone that was the problem. It was the free software I was recording it into. So, I bought a new microphone for no reason. Yay!
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
My German Shepherd got killed on my driveway. My horse got killed outside my house.
I feel very attacked!
Your child's called India.
Da Vinci?
Fuck off, Gillian McKay!
I'm so pale.
Anyway, in today's video, we are going to be talking about probably the most famous urban legend surrounding the all-encompassing, ever-present, ever-powerful Disney. I can't wait to get sued.
Are you gonna hit me?
Do you want it?
I don't want
Because you're
to.
asking for it. You're dying for it. Get off my back.
I'm sure we've all heard the myths and legends surrounding Walt Disney, his films and his theme parks, the real-life skeletons on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, the legend of the abandoned Discovery Island, and the legendary basketball court inside of the Matterhorn Mountain. But no myth is more famous and perhaps more believable than the legend that Walt Disney had his body, or maybe just his head, cryogenically frozen after he died and stored under the Pirates of the Caribbean ride so that one day in the future he could come back and live once again. Although this story sounds absolutely outrageous, it's actually a lot more believable than you would expect. Let's jump into it. I'm going to start by explaining a little bit of the history of cryogenics and how it works or is supposed to work in the future. So if you already know about cryogenics or don't really care and just want to hear the Disney story, then skip to this time and that way you can skip all of my babbling. I personally didn't know anything really about cryogenics before I started researching for this video, and it's actually so fascinating. And you know, I am here to spread knowledge and tales, so that is what I must do. So, cryogenics wasn't really a thing until 1964 when Robert Ettinger, a physics professor at Highland Park Community College in Michigan, published a book called The Prospect of Immortality. Ettinger had developed an interest in the idea of freezing human bodies to be reanimated in the future when he was just a little boy, as he was an avid reader of science fiction novels, and this was a very common narrative at the time. It kind of reminds me of, I don't think it's really the same thing, but you know in films like Event Horizon where they freeze them aboard the spaceship to be woken up hundreds of years in the future, or even actually Captain America's entire storyline. My point is, it's always been a very popular narrative in science fiction novels and films, but until Robert Ettinger, it hadn't ever really been considered as a realistic method of extending human life. Benjamin Franklin did show some interest in the theory in 1773, but obviously considering what life and especially science was like back then, he knew that it was a very forward-thinking concept. Very forward-thinking considering oxygen wasn't discovered until 1772, the year before. Franklin wrote though, "I wish it were possible to invent a method of embalming drowned persons in such a manner that they might be recalled to life at any period, however distant, since he had a strong desire to observe the state of America 100 years hence. But he knew, in all probability, we live in a century too little advanced and too near the infancy of science to see such an art brought to its perfection in our lifetime." Ettinger had very much the same desire, but he was lucky. He was living in the 1960s and not the 1770s. Ettinger's book, The Prospect of Immortality, became quite literally the Bible of the cryogenics movement. It outlined Ettinger's plans for how cryogenics could work, what benefits it would have, and provided scientific evidence to prove that it may actually be possible to reanimate somebody hundreds of years in the future. Some of these experiments included one undertaken by 3 Japanese professors, Isamu Suda, Kei Kito, and C. Adachi, in the mid-1960s. Just a trigger warning, I am going to be talking about experiments on animals, and though it's not really crazy graphic, if you don't really want to hear about that, then I would recommend skipping to this time. I'm just loving the timestamps today. The researchers took a bunch of cat brains, drained them of blood and filled them with glycerol, and then froze them for a period of time ranging from overnight to 6 months. They were then thawed out once their time was up, and the glycerol was removed and replaced with warm, fresh cat blood. The researchers then fixed electrodes to the brains and hooked them up to a brainwave recorder. To the researchers' surprise, the brainwave recorder picked up activity on a brain which had been frozen for 6 months and hadn't even fully thawed out yet. These brainwaves weren't any different to the ones that were being produced before the brain was frozen, and they were happening spontaneously. The researchers weren't giving them any electric shocks or anything. The researchers published their findings, writing, "At this stage, we wish to conclude that brain cells are not exceptionally vulnerable to lack of oxygen. It appears that even nerve cells of the brain can survive and be revived after long-term storage in special circumstances." Similar studies were repeated on monkey and dog brains as well, with similar results. As well as this, what I found to be a very compelling study was one on a beagle called Miles. Though Miles was never completely frozen, he was cooled to within a few degrees of freezing, about 1 degree Celsius or 34 degrees Fahrenheit for you American folk. His blood was completely drained and replaced with a blood substitute. What I am presuming, this wasn't in the book that I read, but based on other experiments they've done on animals, I'm guessing that this was glycerol. He was held like this for about half an hour, and then he was warmed back up to room temperature and his original blood was restored. Remarkably, Miles eventually got up and walked away like a normal dog again. He also, by the way, ended up becoming a bit of a media sensation. Our frozen king. Who needs Elsa? The Disney movie should have been on Miles. Speaking of Disney, let's get this back to the Walt Disney story. As I'm sure everybody knows, Walt Disney was a very, very rich man, and the 1960s was just about the peak for the Walt Disney Company. They began to expand into television with The Mickey Mouse Club and Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. Some of their most iconic films were released in that decade, including Mary Poppins, 101 Dalmatians, and The Jungle Book, and in 1955 their first theme park, Disneyland, opened in Anaheim, California, and the crowds as well as the attractions were ever growing. But, as is life, when things seem to be going so well, something inevitably must bring it to a crashing halt. Walt Disney had been a heavy smoker for much of his life. I read that he used to smoke anywhere between 1 to 3 packets of cigarettes a day. Unsurprisingly, by the 1960s, this had really taken a toll on his health. He had developed a nasty cough that was apparently so bad that his employees said they always knew when he was coming because they could hear his hacking, dry cough from all the way down the hall. Fans of the TV show Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color had begun to notice how exhausted he looked, and even wrote him concerned letters about how raspy his voice had become. Disney had been a long-time sufferer of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and emphysema, and had severe damage to his cervical spine, which is the bit just at the back of your neck, because of an injury when he was playing polo in the 1930s. In early November of 1966, Disney began to complain of a chronic neck and leg pain which was interfering with his ability to work. After a chest x-ray, doctors discovered a tumour the size of a walnut in his left lung, and surgeons recommended that either his entire left lung or just a portion of it, every source said differently, that it be removed. Disney returned to St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank on November the 6th for his surgery. The surgeons removed his left lung, or a bit of it, but found that the tumour was consistent with bronchogenic cancer, if that's how you pronounce it, and that it had already spread to his lymph nodes and other parts of his body. Doctors gave him anywhere between 6 months and 2 years to live. He began chemotherapy and cobalt x-ray treatments, but it was already too late. He was rushed back to St. Joseph's Hospital 2 weeks later and died of circulatory collapse at 9:30 a.m. on December the 15th, 1966. Here is where the urban legend lies. According to Disney's family, Walt's body was cremated 2 days after his death. A very small private funeral was held the day after his death on December the 16th. Only his wife, his daughters, and their husbands and children attended. His ashes were interred at the family mausoleum in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. The exact location of Disney's final resting place is not public knowledge. Though Disney's family claimed that Disney had a rather unremarkable send-off, fans and theorists began to speculate otherwise. As I mentioned, the idea of cryogenics had become hugely popular in the 1960s. Robert Ettinger was always in the media, and there had even been 2 formations of cryogenic societies, one in California and the other one in New York. And as Disney was incredibly wealthy, people began to speculate that he hadn't actually been cremated, he had been cryogenically frozen, with some even going as far to say that his frozen body was being held under the newly constructed Pirates of the Caribbean ride. But where did this legend stem from? Well, the earliest known record of this story is from 1967, just a few weeks after Disney's death. A reporter from the National Spotlight claimed that he had snuck into St. Joseph's Hospital, which was apparently right across the street from the Disney studios, while Disney was being held there. The story goes that the reporter, disguised as an orderly, broke into a storage room, and there he found Disney's body being held in a metal cryogenic cylinder. In 1969, the French magazine Ici Paris published an article claiming that several Disney employees had come forward to confirm that he had in fact been cryogenically frozen. A little later, in 1969, a US magazine called The National Tattler published an article saying that Disney had apparently told doctors to thaw him out in 1975. And, if these rumours didn't need to be any more solidified, in 1972, Robert Nelson, the president of the California Cryogenic Society, told the Los Angeles Times that he had actually been in talks with Disney to have Disney's body cryogenically frozen just weeks before he died. But that, unfortunately, Disney hadn't been able to sort the payment out before he died, as it came so suddenly. Nelson said, "The truth is, Walt missed out. He never specified it in writing, and when he died, the family didn't go for it. They had him cremated. I personally have seen his ashes. They're in Forest Lawn. 2 weeks later, we froze the first man. If Disney had been the first, it would have made headlines around the world and been a real shot in the arm for cryonics." Though Nelson is clearly arguing that Disney wasn't actually frozen, he did confirm that Disney at least wanted to be. Though many people have disputed Nelson's claims, with some saying that he made the story up just for publicity, and others saying that he must have been paid off by the Disney company, so if a professional was saying Disney wasn't frozen, that everyone would stop talking about the legend. Allegedly. Don't sue me. It still remains a very believable legend, however. Many cite the fact that, though Disney passed away at 9:30 a.m. on December the 15th, 1966, his death was not announced to the press until several hours later. They argue that this was to ensure that the media wouldn't crowd the hospital or around the hospital, so that the cryonicists could work secretly to freeze Disney's body and then transport it from the hospital to Disneyland without anybody seeing. This version of events was solidified by Leonard Mosley in his book Disney's World. Mosley wrote, "It was not until hours after he was declared dead that an announcement was made. The announcement stated that there would be no funeral. He had already been cremated." Mosley's argument here was how weird it was that the family would wait so many hours to alert the press, especially considering how famous Disney was, and that they would have his body cremated so soon after his death. However, Mosley's claims aren't exactly correct, as there is proof that Disney was cremated 2 days after his death, not immediately after, as Mosley claims. But, I guess paper trails can be faked, but why would they? As well as this, the family didn't tell the press anything really about how ill Disney was. They announced that his original hospitalization for the removal of his lung had been for treatment of an old neck injury, and when he was readmitted to the hospital just 2 weeks before he died, they said it was just a routine post-op checkup. Perhaps the main reason for the media silence was just to stop swarms of reporters crowding St. Joseph's Hospital, hindering not only Disney's but also every other patient's chance of recovery. Though some speculate that, again, this was a deliberate attempt to hide the fact that behind the scenes, the cryonicists were working to freeze Disney's body. Another reason people began to believe the legend was because Disney had such a tiny funeral. He was arguably the most famous man in America and incredibly rich, so for many it was a big surprise that Disney's funeral wouldn't have been a bigger event. For the theorists, this was because Disney's funeral was just a cover-up. There was no body to bury or ashes to inter, as he had been cryogenically frozen. Though, to counteract this point, Disney's daughter Diane wrote a biography of her father called The Story of Walt Disney, which came out a decade before his death, where she claimed that Disney hated funerals. So much so that he told his family that he didn't want one because he wanted people to remember him alive. But the legend still goes on, with many biographies citing that Disney seemed to have a bit of an obsession with dying. Supposedly, he had been told by a fortune teller that he was going to die when he was 35, and even when he progressed past this age, every time he thought about dying, he became incredibly depressed and closed himself off for days. Biographers argue that Disney would have done anything if he thought it could prolong his life. Disney had a vision and a dream for the future that he wanted to make reality with his Epcot project. Disney's Community of Tomorrow project was designed to demonstrate how Americans would live, work, and survive in the future. According to these biographies, Disney desperately wanted to live to see his Epcot dream become a reality. So desperately that he was willing to explore the newly founded cryonics movement. Walt Disney, Hollywood's Dark Prince, written by Mark Elliott, states, Disney's growing preoccupation with his own mortality also led him to explore the science of cryonics. Disney often mused to Roy, his brother, about the notion of having himself frozen, which received indulgent nods from his brother. Though Elliott's sources behind this information seem to be pretty much non-existent, and Roy has never actually publicly spoken about Disney having an interest in cryonics, but it isn't entirely unfounded. Disney clearly didn't like the idea of dying. His own daughter wrote about how much he hated funerals, and the public knew that he was a technological innovator. Just a few years before his death, Disney had been involved in a number of projects that cemented his status as a technological innovator. Disneyland attractions like the monorail, the introduction of audio animatronic figures at the 1964 World's Fair, and Disney's plans for his Community of Tomorrow outlined to people just how talented Disney was. Would it really be so surprising that a man who could make such advancements in film and animatronics would also make advancements in science as well? Though members of Disney's family have stated publicly that they don't believe Disney ever read anything about cryonics, it does seem very unlikely that he wouldn't have. Disney was clearly a man obsessed with technology, and as I said, the cryonics movement was making waves in the 1960s. It was quite literally everywhere. Even if Disney wasn't actively seeking it out, there is no way he could have missed it. And on a personal note, if I was living in a time period where people had suddenly begun to make absolute advancements in the idea of prolonging human life and I guess also transporting people into the future in some ways, I would absolutely be reading up on that all the time. That would be so interesting. That is fascinating to me now in 2020, so I can't imagine how crazy something like that would have been in the 1960s. The first man to actually be cryogenically frozen, by the way, just to add this in, was a man called Dr. James Bedford. He was 73 years old and was a retired psychology professor from Glendale, California. He was dying of cancer and decided that he wanted to be reanimated one day, so he left $4,200 in his will to ensure that he would be frozen. He died on January 12, 1967, and his frozen body is still being held at the Alcor Institute in Arizona to this day. I'll have a little story for you next week, by the way, on Alcor, and it is truly wild and out with Nick Cannon. It's insane. But the point I was making with that little sidetrack there was that considering the fact that the first man to be frozen was frozen only a few weeks after Disney's death, it's not entirely unbelievable that the technology would have been there and ready when Disney died. The legend has remained so strong after all these years, particularly due to the release of Disney's Frozen in 2013. I don't think I need to explain to you what Frozen is about, it's pretty self-explanatory anyway, but people began to theorise that the name of the film was very calculated. Frozen is kind of loosely based on the Snow Queen, so it really could have been called anything, but fans speculate that the title Frozen was given deliberately as a way of hiding the legend about Disney. Essentially, from 2013 onwards, anytime you Google Disney Frozen, all that's going to come up is information about the film, making it much harder for people to learn about the Disney legend. Disney is incredibly protective of their family-friendly brand, and having a rumour like that attached to them probably isn't ideal. Therefore, they would want to hide it in any way they could. They apparently used to edit cigarettes out of Disney's hand at photographs of him at Disneyland because they couldn't deal with people knowing that Disney was not as wholesome as they want you to think. So it's not so unfounded that they would go to the lengths of making a movie called Frozen just to hide these unsavoury rumours about them. Some also argue that Frozen was actually made as a kind of homage to the legend. The producers knew that titling the film Frozen would get people talking. As well as this, Disney have been known for putting little Easter eggs in their films for years now. Some speculate that the fact that Olaf often has his head separate from his body in the promotional pictures for Frozen is kind of like an animated joke at the idea that Disney's Frozen body is separated from his Frozen head. Whatever the reason, it's certainly fun to speculate about. But in my personal opinion, I will say that if Disney was cryogenically frozen, I can't understand why the family would want to hide that. I don't think it's particularly shameful or degrading for the Disney brand. If anything, it kind of keeps the magic more alive. What's more magical than the idea that this man could come back one day in the future and start making films again? Although I do wonder if it would perhaps have something to do with the critics of cryogenics. Lots of people are really opposed to it, especially on religious grounds, as I guess it could kind of be seen as cheating death or going against God's will. So maybe Disney's family wouldn't want to come out and admit to this because they wouldn't want to risk losing potentially hundreds of thousands of fans who are opposed to cryogenics for religious or ethical reasons. They have been known to hide some creepy, ethically questionable things about the brand before. There was a point in time where all the skeletons on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride were real skeletons that belonged to real people. Although these were removed at some point, probably in the 1990s, people do speculate that one does still remain, the one on the headboard, as it was too difficult to remove. So, Disney do be doing some weird stuff. But maybe the family just won't admit to this story because it frankly isn't true. I suppose there isn't really a lot of physical evidence to prove that this is true, but do you know what? Who cares? It's fun to speculate about and it's not hurting anybody. That's what I think is so interesting about cryogenics, is that really, what is the worst that can happen? That it doesn't work and you don't come back? How will you know? You'll be dead! Anyway, the legend is so popular still to this day that last year a short film was produced called The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head, which played on the idea that Disney was frozen and being held on Disneyland property. I love it! It's just so fun! It's such a fun theory. Anyway, that's the end of this week's video. That's about all I've got to say. If you did enjoy it, then please give it a like and do subscribe if you want to see more like it. If you want to follow me on any of my social medias, they will be linked down below in the description, as well as all the sources that I used for this video if you fancy a little bit of extra reading. I would actually really recommend, if you are interested in reading about the history of cryogenics, checking out a book called Great Mumbo Chicken and the Transhuman Condition, Science Slightly Over the Edge by Ed Regis. It will be linked in the description as well. It was such an interesting read, probably one of the most interesting books I've read in years, and I really like his really casual writing style. It's not overcomplicated at all. Loved it. Great book, would really recommend. If you have any suggestions of any other cases you'd like me to cover, or any comments in particular on this case, then please do comment them down below. As I said, next week's video is also going to be on a cryogenic scandal. It's not film related, but it is just so wild. I just had to tell you guys about it because it's insane, and I just want to sit on my roof and with a megaphone and just be like, listen to this story, how crazy is this? So this is my equivalent of doing that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week for a video that isn't a movie mysteries, but it's going to be really fun, so see you later. Bye!